All right, welcome everyone to Power of Work's presentation on eTMF systems. So just to kind of give you an idea that we've been the last couple of weeks working on how to QC a document, what you're expecting when you're looking at a document, and kind of the overall thoughts behind everything, the importance of looking at why TMF is important, right? So remember that TMF is trial master file, and these are the documents that are being collected throughout a clinical study, right? And then they're being kind of put into a folder. Back in the day, that used to be actually paper documents, and they would be physically collected, sometimes mailed in or scanned and sent in. But nowadays, it's more system related. And so today we'll go a little bit on some overviews about systems, and we can talk about systems. And then this is a part two part presentation. The second part will be more about like what to do in a system and some examples and what you're looking for. And then usually when let's say you get a job, you get a TMF job, you're going to have that company has one system, and we'll talk about that, but it might be different, but it's usually very similar work, right? So just as I mentioned, it's usually been historically it's paper documents, and they've been put in a physical file cabinet. And so a lot of times when I try to describe TMF and describe an eTMF, it's nice to think of it as an actual file folder. And so you can have like a drawer, and then within the drawer, so your drawer could be like your zone, and then you might have folders, and then within your folders, you might have like kind of subfolders or tabs within the folder. And so that's kind of a good way to think of it if you're kind of new to it and you're trying to get your head around what is TMF, right? And then we found this really cute little image here that kind of emphasizes the fact that it's been hard for a lot of people to transition to digital. And we'll talk about the benefits of going digital. But I think this is one reason why Power of Work has focused on TMF as kind of our first career tackle in terms of helping people gain a really useful skill, is because it's a skill that's in need. There's a lot of people who have a lot of experience in clinical research, but back in their day, it was all paper. So there's not that many people that have a TMF skill and are very familiar with the system. A lot of people who have a lot of experience in clinical research tend to be older and tend not to have a lot of technical skills. And so they're usually like less willing to do TMF technically, because it's a whole new system to learn. So that's why I think it's kind of a niche, a good entry point, because it's needed and it's not as though everyone has these skills. And this actually is one way that I think I kind of broke into this industry about, I think like 6 or 7 years ago. I was able to get a TMF manager position. It was actually like a project manager spot, but because I didn't have that much management experience, but I had TMF and I had eTMF experience, which having that combination of a little bit of clinical research in terms of like clinical operations, a little bit of actual knowing how the system works, knowing how like updates work, like a very technical side from it, and then also some like a little bit of management, I think usually that wouldn't be enough to get you a management spot. But because it was kind of a niche field and not that many people had the combination of both technical and experience with like clinical research and what TMF was, I was able to get the position, and it kind of kickstarted my career and kind of highlighted the fact that not that many people actually know TMF and are technically savvy and want to do the work, right? So I do think it's a great career to start, and so that's why I think it's a good first tackle for Power of Work. Okay, so yeah, so basically before 2009, it was all just paper, just filing cabinets, and we can have people from Power of Work attest to that some companies still do. They still have what's called like a TMF room, where it's just a room, like a not like a library, because it's not as cool as a library, but basically just a room just filled with cabinets. And in those cabinets, they'll be locked and kind of protected. But it's a lot harder to find things, as we'll talk about. Part of, because as it says here, as the number of clinical trials increase, it's harder to access, audit, and store and submit. So that's kind of why, how we're going to actually, have an eTMF system is because there was a need for it, right? And so, yeah. All right, clinical trial documents. So as we talked about, there are a lot of documents in running a clinical trial. So basically, there are documents from lots of different functions within the sponsor company, right? That's the company that the sponsor is the person who you think about like owns the medication. A lot of times they're the ones that actually have done the research, right? So they have like laboratories and they've done research on this drug and they think, okay, now we're ready to move it to humans, right? Or sometimes they've bought the drug from somebody and they're like, okay, we're good at running clinical trials. We'll do this. But then there's also a lot of documents that come from the site, which is where the patients are actually seen. And that's when they, like, let's say they get the drug, they see their doctor, and that's called the site. So there's a lot of documents that come from all different departments and different aspects, right? There could be documents from the site, but like from the sites like IRB or kind of more like approvals. And then there's, having to do with, let's say, a safety report regarding a certain patient. And then on the sponsor side, there could be a lot of documents in terms of all these different departments that support how a clinical trial is run, in terms of like, did the drug get to the site and was it did it have the correct temperature the whole time? Those kind of aspects. So there's a lot of documents, and that's why I saw this image here with this printer and all these documents flying everywhere. That's kind of how I imagine it used to be, and that's why it's critical now to be digital. And I'll talk a little bit more about finding things and how that has to do with audits. But in general, you'll hear this a lot in TMF, but they say if it wasn't documented, it doesn't exist. And so basically making sure that you have the document and are able to retrieve the document is very, very important. Okay, eTMF. So eTMF is a digital filing structure, and it's usually in a cloud space, and then it's controlled access. So you can see who's accessed it and when, and that way it's good for an audit, right? So that's one aspect of having a filing cabinet system, where you might have a track for who's got access to the door, but in general, you can't really track who's getting into what. And if you are, in terms of like a lock and key system, it's actually really hard to figure out not only who had access to what key, like, so you could have like a log where you'd say like, oh, I'm checking out this section, this cabinet, but then it's even more complicated, because if you have a lock and key section kind of system set up, you have to figure out like who has the key, and it's just like a lot more work, right? And there's also like the physical aspect of having a room, and then you also have to have like fire safety for the room and a lot of other issues. So it's a lot easier now to just have it in the cloud, and it's a lot more secure. And then there's also like different tools and strategies that you can use to help the clinical trial by having the eTMF, so you can like perform your own little audits and checks are a lot easier within having a digital system. Like, it's easier to access, and it's also easier to share access. So for example, there's something called a CRO, which is your clinical research organization, and that's a separate company that really supports clinical trials in general. So most sponsor companies will hire a CRO to help them run their clinical trial, just because there's so many components to the clinical trial. But if a CRO is helping and you didn't have an eTMF, that would be really difficult in the sense of who has the documents. Do all the documents live with the CRO? Because if they're keeping a file structure, you want all the documents in one spot. And so that somebody has to physically go to the file and like look at the documents. So it's a lot easier to share and have different people checking on their documents than it is to have like a room with paper. And then it contains, right, it's like software, and it helps manage the different documents. And so, yeah. Okay, so here are a couple different eTMFs. And Viva Vault is a major one. Montrium is also a smaller one that is newer and it's not on here yet. But the idea that I wanted to emphasize is that we can teach you different like basic eTMF like practices and kind of like what you do and what you look for. But it is really different. It's not that different in a sense, company to company. So it's like if you learn the basic skills of like, okay, you're looking at a document, how you're pulling a report, or how you are trying to get the data and use the data to improve the TMF. You can basically learn these basic skills that apply to different systems, right? So a company usually will only have one of these unless, for example, like I mentioned, there's a CRO that they've hired and the CRO is also managing the TMF and they've already hired their own. But usually most company will have, okay, we are just doing Viva, we're just using Trial Interactive. So you only have to really usually learn one system per like company or like job, right? But it is good to learn different systems. And so that is something that I recommend, and we can even try to find different videos to show a little bit on each system. Okay, so here are some advantages. So it's easier to find documents. And that's what we talked a little bit about, right? One of the things for when you have an audit is that the idea is that you can pull a document, and by pulling a document and being able to find a document easily, that means that you guys are that the company is really doing a good job of maintaining and utilizing their documents, right? So if an auditor comes in and says, find me this monitoring report, you can find the monitoring report because you can go into the system really easily and search for the monitoring report, right? And if you've named the document correctly, which is something we've talked about in previous, you want to classify it, kind of put it into the correct folder, and you want to have the correct name. So naming it monitoring report versus naming it the confirmation letter, that helps people know and be able to pull the correct document. And as a result, that shows that you're kind of utilizing your documents, you're running your study well. If you can't find it, then to the auditor, and this is, let's say this audit's from the FDA, and you're trying, your study's done, and you're trying to say, hi, I'd like to sell this drug. It did really well. Everyone was happy. It was effective. It was safe. The FDA goes, okay, cool. Let me look, right? And they'll audit lots of different aspects, but they'll also audit the TMF. And that's kind of how they look at how the study was run, is based on the document. So it's really important. And it's really important that you're able to find the documents. And that's why in the past, it used to be, okay, I want the monitoring report for this one site. Somebody would have to go to the room, like open up the drawers, find the right folder, and hope it in the folder it's there, and then bring that report over to the auditor. Whereas now it's a lot easier with an eTMF system because they can just look it up, right? And then you have real-time tracking and document viewing. So one aspect of modern eTMF world in the auditing is that when you upload a document, there's a timestamp on it now. So auditors are able to see that you are maintaining your TMF nicely, like timely, that you're making sure that documents, when they're created, they're quickly put into the eTMF. Now that's really good if you're good at your TMF. That's not always the case across the board, but in general, it helps the auditors know that you were on top of your work, basically. So you can have real-time access and viewing your documents, and there's a timestamp on it. So it's just kind of a better system in that sense. Like I said, it does open up a potential gap where it can highlight where people are doing something wrong if they're not uploading their documents in a timely manner. But overall, that's just better for everybody to have it be digital and easily accessed. Now, it's reducing auditing by making sure that like you can have a formal QC aspect. So right, when you upload a document, and we'll go into this in a little bit detail in the future. So you upload a document, somebody puts in the metadata, and then usually somebody else will look at it. And then sometimes there'll be a two-step QC. So if, again, per the company's policies, but let's say somebody who owns a document, like somebody from a certain department. Let's say we talked about IP shipment. That is when the drug gets sent out to the site. So from the Department of Clinical Supply, they will have a form that shows, okay, this is what the drug was sent over and the temperature was okay, right? Then they take that document, they upload it into the system, they put the metadata in. And so that's kind of a different department than the department that runs TMF, right? That would be like the document owner. That person uploads the document into the system. And then usually the role of like the TMF team is somebody looks at the document and makes sure, it goes very carefully and makes sure that all the data is correct and it looks really good. And if it's not, they'll send it back, or they'll have questions or whatnot. But if that looks really good, then it'll go on to a second step. That would be a 2QC process. And then somebody else within the TMF team does another look. And usually at this point, everything should be entered, everything should be good because somebody already looked at it. But so that way you'd have a 2QC step process. And as a result, it should be easier to catch things, right? If you had just a paper system and you had somebody who was just putting the document in, it's really hard. There would be really hard to have a QC system, right? Like you would have to have somebody else come in and take a look, or you could say, oh, I did file that yesterday. Can you take a look? Like it would be a lot more work if it was just physically paper. Also, back in my day when it was paper, it was an issue where people would file their own TMF documents. Like they would just be like, oh, they would just go in and they would put it in there, and then the TMF team wouldn't really know it's there, and or people would take out documents. So there's definitely more of a controlled process, even prior to going digital, but that some gaps in the process can be like that. So it reduces auditing because you have a lot more, like you have a lot more security on it, and then you're able to kind of have more of a quality control. It's also easier to have like pulling reports from it, right? You can't, back in the day when it was paper, a lot of times you'd have like Excels where you'd enter in, you'd enter in the name of the document. And so that way you had like, that's the only way you could have a tracker of all the documents, is if you had your own tracker, like Excel tracker. Nowadays, because you enter it into the system can output like a report, and you can look and say, okay, here are all the documents in my folder for this study or for this site. So it has a lot more auditing capabilities. Then also one aspect is SOP compliance. So SOP is standard operating procedures. There's a whole bunch of different like guidelines that each company has on how they're going to do things. And it's a lot easier to maintain this when it has an eTMF system. Also, a lot of times, sometimes people put their SOPs in the eTMF system, so you can like review it and see the filing of the SOPs. So that's another aspect. And then, as we mentioned, almost anything going digital, it saves money, right? So there's no more cost of storing things when you have it all digital. There's definitely digital costs, of course, but overall, it's a cost saving. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the easy collaboration with the sites and the CRO, you can have multiple people having access, and they don't have to physically be there to look at the documents. Okay, this is a little blurry. Whoops, let's see if I can go back. Yeah. Okay, so sorry it's a little blurry. We'll get you a better image. I tried to make it larger and it didn't quite help. But basically, I wanted to give you a quick kind of overview and little like sneak peek into the system. We'll go into deeper detail in the future. But basically, I want you to get, if this is such a foreign concept, it's kind of nice to have a little idea of what you would see. So this is a screenshot from an eTMF system, and you can see that you have your document here and your metadata on the right. A lot of times this is how they're set up, and you'll have different features up here and different, like there's a gear wheel to let you do a lot of different aspects. But the basic aspect is that you have your document, you can scroll and view your document, and then your metadata is here. So you have your name, type, your document number, and so you can have like kind of, and so you can see here last modified by. That's an advantage of an eTMF system, is that you can have that record, right? Who's actually who's the last person to touch the document, who uploaded the document, when they uploaded it. That's a lot of that is nicely captured, and like the control is really nice within an eTMF system versus a paper. But just to walk you through, so if you are somebody, we gave the example of somebody from a drug supply uploading a document, but let's say you just started a new TMF job, and this would be kind of rare, but let's say they still had paper documents, and so your job was to upload a whole bunch of documents and make sure the metadata is entered. And so you'd have a big stack of paper, you'd scan it, and then the digital version would now be in your computer, and you'd upload it, and then when you upload it, you would check that the document digital is the correct match against the document that you have physically in front of you, right? So you make sure, one of the aspects that we talked about previously is you make sure all the pages are there. Did you by accident put a giant stack of like a protocol, which is a large document, and so let's say there's like 60 pages, you scan it, and by accident, because it's a double-paged, double-sided document, you only really caught pages 1, 3, 5, like you only captured the odd. So that's like one of your first checks that you're looking for. Is the document complete? Is the digital version a correct match of the paper version? And then you can look at like, what is the document? So this is an SOP, but you could look at, making sure you understand, okay, what is the document, and where does it belong, right? So we talked a little bit about there are different filing structures, right? And so there's documents that can be at the study level, country level, which is common if you have like, let's say, a global study where you have lots of different countries. So that's something that kind of helps you separate out the different documents that are special per country, if it's like a global study. And then you have your site level, which is where a lot of the work is at the site, just because there's a lot of sites. Let's say, you're at a global, you have a global study, and let's say there's like 5 different countries, but within each country, there might be like 20 different sites per country, right? So a lot of documents would reside at the site level. And a lot of times when we go over things here at Power of Work, because the site level is a little bit more standard, and there's a lot of different documents to look at, we're going to really focus on the site level. And so you would figure out, where does this document belong? Like, where does it take place within the structure? And that's why I keep kind of highlighting that knowing your documents and knowing your TMF reference model, which is that kind of filing guidelines that you use to file the documents, is really useful. Like, it's really helpful to know your documents. And then you kind of figure out all these different aspects of what other metadata you want to enter, right? So in a Viva system, usually you upload it, and it'll have one of the first things you do is you talk about like where you file it, what's the artifact. And so you will kind of, from a drop down, pull what folder you basically want it to be in. Some eTMF systems have a lot of like auto naming. So you're telling it what folder you want it to be in. Like, let's say it is a site level document, and it's a certain document that belongs at the site. Let's say, like we talked about, like monitoring reports, right? And so you'll have the drop down, you'll work with the system to put it in the correct folder, and then it will kind of auto name that. So it kind of gives that kind of like your file structure. Like, let's say you're filing something on your computer, and you have something in your documents, and then you have another folder within your documents. Let's say you call it like your homework. And then that way, if you look, there's kind of like a little like code in the sense of where exactly the document is, and it'll say like, oh, documents slash homework, or what slash, right? So it's kind of where you're filing it. And then so in this case, because it's a Viva, it'll have its own Viva number, and so that's easy for you to find it in the future. And if you download a report, sometimes it'll have a link that you can click on. And then there's other different aspects to it. Sometimes here it'll show like what life cycle it's in, and then also it will show, as we mentioned, like who touched the document last, like who's been in the system. But for example, if it's related to a person, like a site personnel, you sometimes will actually have a drop down of what like doctor is on the site. And so you could drop down like, hey, this is a PI and this is his financial disclosure form. And if you have that drop down, you're just tying more metadata to the document. And so that's one reason why eTMF system is a lot better, is because it can kind of help organize the information, and then you can also help have better reports as you're searching for different aspects, right? So yeah, just want to give you a little overview on what you'd expect when you're looking at a document, and then a little introduction to like what a TMF is and what you would kind of expect to see within a TMF. And then later, hopefully next week, we will go over a little bit more detail about like running a report and kind of walking through the steps of what you see when you're uploading and going through a TMF. And so yeah, please let me know if you have any questions, and we will have a Q&A tomorrow. So if you have any questions, make sure you write them down. You can email me in advance, and we can go through any aspects.